management class, because, I mean, if they can make it 68 years, they obviously have it pretty well figured out as compared to a lot of folks in our world today. But what a tremendous example of faith and love that the two of them are. We really appreciate you guys and want to wish y'all a happy anniversary today and hope it's just a absolutely wonderful one. As we enter into our time of discussion in class this morning, Selton, would you mind leading us in a word of prayer as we begin? Amen. Also, Rainbow, meant to mention to you, and it slipped my mind momentarily, but yet this past week, Jan Helm's sister, Brenda Rogers, that some of you know, Brenda's been battling breast cancer for the past year, and she passed away earlier this week, and her funeral was yesterday in Rainsville. So I also want to continue to remember the Helms family in your prayers as well. You know, when most people, as we continue to go through our anger management class here, when most people are trying to unpack and determine what the reason for their anger is, typically we want to blame it on everybody else. Typically we want to point our fingers at life circumstances or at people around us, and we want to say, well, I wouldn't have got mad, but they. And so we always want to pass the buck, as it were, as opposed to just owning our own anger, owning our own, thank you, Brother Jimmy, owning our own outburst. We want to blame it on someone else. There's always some external pressure that we say it's that fault, their fault. My spouse is so uncooperative. My parents, they neglected me. My job is just so stressful. My friends, they don't understand me. My kids are brats. And it's everybody else's fault but mine. And while it's true that all of those external things can bring about anger, it's not entirely their fault. They may push the button on us because we allow them to, But it goes much deeper than any one person or any one circumstance that we face in life. A lot of the anger that we deal with in this life is self-inflicted. I think that's a very important life lesson. And if you don't take anything else away from this morning's lesson, I pray that you will at least embrace this reality. It's not their fault. A lot of the anger that I deal with, regardless of the spectrum, whether it be on the rage side or the depressive side, a lot of the anger that I deal with, it is on my own shoulders. It is self-inflicted in my life. This is an adult Bible class. That means that we as adults surely understand we have the right to free choice. No one makes us do anything. As a matter of fact, in regards to most circumstances of life, we take great pride in that fact. You can't make me do such and such. You can't make me go here or go there. I'm an adult. I'm going to do what I want. You're exactly right. We are adults. And we are going to do what we want. And that includes how we handle our anger. Nobody's going to make you rage, and nobody's going to make you crawl into that hole of depression. It's no one else's fault. I have to learn that so much of what I deal with, so much of what I go through, it is truly self-inflicted. Some of us, we create so much of our anger simply by the bad choices that we make. It's like one man said, I was married once for about 10 months in my early 20s. It went wrong from the start. I'm still not sure why we got married to begin with. A few years later, I got married again. It lasted about 7 years, but we got a divorce after she caught me with another woman. She wasn't happy, and neither was I. We had a son together. I guess he's about 16 or 17 now. I think they're all right. He lives in another state. I don't think I've seen him in about 3 or 4 years. By not taking serious his long-term responsibilities, this particular man's life was in financial strain, broken relationships, moral bankruptcy, and absolute spiritual emptiness. And it was everybody else's fault but his. He couldn't seem to understand why he was in the situation that he was in. You know, somebody asked me a question the other day in regards to they're at a very low point in life. And they said, I just don't know how I got to where I got. And my response was, is that a redundant question, or do you really want to know? Because as a counselor, I can make some keen observations, and as a friend, I can tell you what I think. But ultimately, I think you know what got you to where you are. All of us make our own choices. All of us decide what we're going to do, how we're going to act, and how we're going to react. And it could be that with the example of this individual, maybe you can somewhat relate to that sense of self-sabotage, if nothing else, from your standpoint of it is so much easier to see it in other people. You know, it is so easy for us to watch other people and the train wreck sometimes of their life and go, oh, why can't they see what they have done to themselves? Why can't they understand the road they're on and the path of destruction? I can see exactly where this is going to lead them. I can see how their actions are going to lead to consequences that they're going to be paying for. Oh, man, I've seen it a million times in other people's life, and it's not going to be any different with theirs. If they could only open their eyes and see what they're doing and how it's hurting them and impacting their family and friends. But yet, in regards to myself, in regards to being able to look in the mirror and see it in myself, boy, that's a big struggle for us. It's not everybody else's fault. And in the same way everybody else is accountable for their own actions and reactions, so am I, and so are you. Here's a few very common ways that this self-inflicted anger comes about for a lot of us. One is through moral decline. As we looked at, I think, week 1 and maybe even dove into it a little bit in week 2, anger itself is directly linked to the preservation of personal worth, needs, and convictions. And whenever in my life I feel as though those things are not being met in my life, then I begin to get a little anxious. I begin to get a little bit of anxiety. I begin to react because I'm just trying to stand for those things. And again, if I don't feel that those things are being met in my life, then suddenly anger begins to show its ugly head, irregardless of how I deal with the anger. Because, for the sake of discussion and just for reminder's sake, we all deal with anger just in different ways. Some of us deal with anger in much more explosive ways, loud, out there, rage, just like a skyrocket, man. We go off and everybody knows how we feel. We are absolutely furious. And for others of us, it's still anger, but we don't handle it that way. We let it all be inside. We suppress it. We hold it in. And we refuse to let it all out for whatever our reason. But the ultimate cause of that is we find ourselves in a very depressive state. And so either way, those are the two end results. Now, because of that, when my personal worth, when my needs and my convictions aren't being met, I'm very frustrated. And if you've ever been around people who are angry, again, whether it's explosive or depressive, they are people who are looking for affirmation. They are people who are looking to be loved. They are people who are looking to feel appreciated and respected. And when that affirmation in their life seems to be missing, listen, it's amazing when people can find it in this, in wholesome fellowship that we can enjoy with one another as children of God. When you see people who allow that affirmation to come from like-minded children of God, you know what you begin to see? You begin to see that anger disappear in a person's life, the struggle with it, the great struggle with it. Not that it goes away completely, because it's never going to go away completely, but you see that greater struggle begin to lessen because I feel good, I feel confident, I feel content because I know the people around me love me for me. But whenever we choose a different path, whenever it's not finding that affirmation in those we love that are children of God's, but maybe rather we're trying to find that affirmation in people of the world, we will perpetuate our anger just in the name of social acceptance. And we'll do anything and everything to be accepted by our peers. And sure, in the short term, it feels pretty good. In the moment, we may make some moral concessions. But in the long term, it doesn't do anything but just perpetuate the emotional turmoil and the feelings that we're going through. Emotional turmoil and immorality, they go hand in hand. So much more than I think what we as a people and especially as a society want to begin to understand. If you've got your checklist in front of you, from the paperwork that Brother Jimmy was passing out earlier, let's read through this checklist under moral decline together and be honest with yourself, be reflective, and check those that apply to you. Maybe if not now, even be honest enough to check those that would apply to you even in your past. I cling to lustful thoughts and fantasies more often than I would like. My friends are able to entice me toward activities I should probably avoid. I find myself skeptically questioning the old Puritan rules of living. There are times when I feel like two separate people, a good public person and a private, conniving person. Going to church is more of a ritual than a truly purposeful experience. I'm entertained by rude humor or sordid stories. I have to struggle to maintain purity in my sexual habits. Cutting corners of my responsibilities is easier now than it was 5 years ago. I would rather have a hedonistic night out on the town than a quiet evening at home. I've had several social relationships that began with a thrill but ended in frustration. If you checked at least 4 of those, then there have probably been more than a few times in your life when you can recall your anger showed its ugly head in result of those things. We live in a world of no absolutes. We live in a world that is very permissive, a society that really only asks the question of, what does moral purity really have to do with emotions? Now, we know as children of God, we know, for example, 1 Corinthians 6:18 tells us to flee fornication. And hopefully, as children of God, we understand the boundaries that God has established for in mankind's sexual relationship, and that it is there, that marriage bed is to be undefiled between a husband and wife. Hopefully, we understand all of that, and we understand that that is a God-ordained thing that should be respected and upheld. But to our world, they say, what's the big deal? I mean, who you hurting? It's just a night of fun. It's just a night of passion and pleasure. It's not that big a deal. It's so archaic to think that way, so outdated. This is a new time and a new world, and you should just be able to have fun and do whatever you want to do. It's just normal. It's healthy. Well, what's all the fuss about? Moral purity is not just a code that we live by that dictates right or wrong. Ultimately, it is also a reflection of my respect toward myself and toward my fellow human beings, in that we are all created in the very image of God. Immorality, whether people want to acknowledge it in the moment, but immorality leaves people with a sense of meaninglessness. And that meaninglessness, that's a hard word to say 3 times fast, but that meaninglessness, that then begins to bubble up an internal question of, why do I feel so dissatisfied? Why do I always want more? Why is it that I never seem to have enough? That frustration that slowly begins to bubble up within a person, it's because they're trying to take immorality and fill a void in their life that only God can fill. And using that immorality, whatever that immorality may be for you, that immorality just breeds, again, meaninglessness. You want to be fulfilled. You want to be satisfied. You want to understand what it means to be content and not struggle so much with anger, with your rage, or with your depressiveness. Okay. Then stop using immorality as your vehicle to fill the void that only God can fill. Anytime there is moral decline in your life or mine, anger is going to continue to just stick its head out time and time again. It will continue to be something that we struggle with. Another is when work becomes all-encompassing. You know, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, God, when He created man, when He created Adam, He gave him the responsibility of taking care of the garden and overseeing creation. I think that's a powerful thing, especially in our world. I think that's something that we need to think about more. As I mentioned in our Christian ethics class on Wednesday night upstairs, you know, we live in a world where we act like work is a bad word. But it's not. I mean, from the very beginning, God made work because work gives man purpose. Work helps give man fulfillment. So it was God's idea, and even before sin entered the picture, and I think that's another huge misunderstanding that we have sometimes, we want to blame the fact we work on the fall. You know, in other words, we want to blame work. You know, if Adam and Eve hadn't messed up in that garden, we'd all still be running around naked and not have jobs. Well, we may all still be naked, but we'd still be working. See, even before the fall of man, there was work. God created work. Work is a good thing. It's just as a result of the fall, work got harder. All right? But work itself is a good thing. It is a God-ordained thing. Now, God has created us. Again, we have this sense of this purpose in us, this healthy pride that comes about when a job is finished. Now, I don't know about for you, but for me, you know, there is nothing that I enjoy quite as much as looking at my yard when I'm done cutting the grass. I can't really explain it, but I do. I love it. I love stepping back and going, that's all right. And I'm not good at it, okay? And I know that there's a lot of people who could do a lot better job of cutting my grass and weed eating and making my yard look immaculate. And I'm not saying that I necessarily enjoy it in the moment, but I kind of do. But I mean, it is hard work. But when it's done, I like being able to step back and go, hey now, all right. And I like the smell too. But you know what happens when you take it too far? When you allow work, whatever the work of your life is, to get out of balance, when work suddenly becomes the ultimate goal in your life, when it's all about work, you're taking a good God-given thing and you allow it to get out of balance. Now, what happens in people's lives, and maybe this is just people you know, surely it's not happened to you personally, but what happens to those people who get so overwhelmed with work and the busyness of life? What is it that we typically say? We are so stressed out. Yeah, that's not you, right? I mean, that's just everybody else. Our work stresses us out. Suddenly, the very thing that God has given to us as a part of who we are, we allow it to go too far. We've allowed it to become too much of who we are. We've gotten it out of balance, and suddenly we are so stressed out because of our job, because of our work. And you know what I found? Overworked, stressed people are not happy people. Overworked, overstressed people are angry people. Overworked, overstressed people suddenly find absolutely no satisfaction in the very job God has given them to do. Overworked people, overstressed people are people who are suddenly blowing up at everybody at work. They're just boiling over with rage all the time. Or they are so depressed because they can find absolutely no joy or meaning in what they're doing. But my God says, whatever you do, do it with all your heart. My God says that I've given you a job to do. Do it well. But don't do it for man. You do it for me. So, overstressed, overworked people, man, all the anger we deal with as a result of our overwork. Now, don't let me give the impression for a moment that I think you ought to go to the other extreme either. All right? I don't want you to think that the solution to overwork is no work. Because again, God created work. And God wants us to work. God says if a man doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. Okay? So, I mean, we know that there is a place for work. That if a man doesn't provide for his family, he is worse than an infidel. All right? So we know that we should be working. But we've got to find balance. Like anything else in life. Our jobs, our careers, our work, they can't become the totality of who we are. We have to keep those things balanced. Keep the times of work balanced with the times of play so that we can experience a little bit more peace within our life. For some, material gain is overemphasized. You know, there are some people that material gain seems to be necessary for them to really experience happiness. Sometimes we may kiddingly refer to this as retail therapy. You know, I am so stressed out. I'm so overworked. Oh, I'm so upset right now. I just got to go buy something. I got to go to the store. I got to go get something new, because once I have something new, then suddenly all the stress goes away. And if that's who you are, then you have an addiction just as anyone else. Okay? It's just usually a more expensive addiction. You know, if you think that new outfit is going to make your problems suddenly go away, it's no different than the person who thinks that the problems will go away at the bottom of a bottle. It's just a more socially acceptable addiction, but it is still an addiction. And you say, well, it doesn't have the same type of ramifications. It does if you're spending more than you make. Because at that point, you've got a lot of financial worries on top of the stresses that you already had. All right, so you got to be very careful with this mentality of retail therapy. If we really want the anger in our life to be lessened, there are things that will lessen anger. Things like love and acceptance. You can't buy those things. Those things are not for sale. But when we anchor our emotions in this false security of materialism, then we are going to find ourselves very vulnerable to anger. I think probably the most common type of anger and the most common type of emotion where this rears its head, of course, is envy. And that there is just pure frustration over having something that someone else has. Maybe it's your neighbor's new siding. Maybe it's your neighbor's new car. Maybe it's the family member's new car. Maybe it's the family member's new house. Maybe it's their new purse. I don't know what it is. But all of us have experienced it. There has been a point in time in all of our lives, hopefully more so in the past than in the present, but maybe even in the present for some, where we have seen what somebody else had, and there was not a part of our body that was happy for them. We wanted it. And we were mad or we were sad that we couldn't have it. That's envy. And envy then laps over and begins to show itself in anger. We talk bad about the person who has it because we're so envious. We'll lash out at them in anger over what they have because it's what we don't have. Or we become so insecure in our depression because what's wrong with us? Why can they have these things but I can't have these things? And so much of our emotions then are tied to material things. You know, for some there's a frustration even if you win the race of materialism, and that is maybe you do have more than anybody else on the street. Hey, Brother Wilson, do you like the old phrase of keeping up with the Joneses? Because I don't. I'm not a fan of that, right? But y'all know what that means. That just means you're trying to keep up with the people next door. You want to have as much as they have. Okay, now let's say you're as lucky as me and Wilson, and you finally get to be one of the Joneses, all right? So you finally reach that point. Maybe you're the have instead of the have-not. You know what the temptation then is? The temptation then is all of a sudden you develop a very sinful sense of superiority, that you're better because you have something that moth and rust is still going to destroy. You have something that the fire of God is still one day going to consume. Good job. Good for you. It doesn't make you better. But because you've put so much hope in these things, then all of a sudden it does begin to create that superiority within you. Or if you can't acquire that which you crave, all of a sudden you find yourself with so much discouragement. And even that discouragement becomes so overwhelming. If you look at the checklist there on your list, it says, I have a great desire to appear successful. I often put on a false front, hoping to create a good impression. I sometimes indulge fantasies of what it might be like to be at the top. If I achieve something or buy something new, I want people to notice. Let me stop there just a second. You know what's always struck me as sadly comical? The way a church building can turn into a fashion show sometimes. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever noticed the way sometimes we can get new things, and whether it be pulling up a new car in the parking lot, or a new clothes, or a new dress, or new jewelry, and we come strutting in, and we want everybody, oh, you noticed that. Oh, it's just a little thing I just picked up the other day. You know that false humility. It's called lying. That's what it is. You see, you probably struggle with it more than you want to admit, because we all do that. We all can get caught up in putting our self-worth in the worth of the things God has given us. Now, underline that. It's what God gave you. You didn't do it. And the quicker you begin to acknowledge that God gave it to you, the easier it is to not get so full of yourself. Because as long as you think you did it and that you acquired it and that you purchased it and look what you've accomplished, then there is a great concern that that pride is going to build up in you. But when you're humble enough to be able to truly know where it comes from and that it comes from above, and that it's just yours on loan, it's just yours to use for the glory of God, and that it's not about you, well, then all of a sudden the catwalk disappears. All of a sudden you come into the house of the Lord for He who gave you that which you have. You're here for Him, for no one else. For no one else's approval, for no one else's compliments, for no one else's pat on the backs, for no one else to say, oh, how beautiful. You're here. You're here because you love the Lord, and you know how much He loves you. But that material gain being overemphasized can be a very, very dangerous thing. When our needs and wants are finally put into proper perspective, then our anger level begins to decrease. Substance abuse becomes much more likely whenever our anger is self-inflicted. You know, my generation, Now, Anthony's generation, we were the first to really reap the benefits, if you want to call it that, of the Just Say No. You know, when First Lady Reagan came out with the Just Say No program, just say no to drugs. And so for all of us growing up in the early 80s and mid-80s, man, it was all about just saying no to drugs. Why? Because drugs and alcohol was so rampant across our country and still is, that there was a need to really get the message out, even to children, to say, don't do these things. And that's a good thing. I'm glad that education is there. But how sad is it that that education has to be in place? I mean, really, how tragic of a society and a world do we live where we have to and continue to teach our children to say, don't do these things. Don't drink alcohol. Don't do drugs. It's so easy to go down that road, so easy to get caught up in those things. You will ruin your life. But you know what happens? A lot of times what happens, the first time that a person takes a drink or does drugs, rarely, I'm not saying that it never happens this way, but very rarely is a person just sitting home alone one day. More times than not, they're with a buddy or two. They're in a peer group that is doing said activity, whatever activity may be. And it doesn't really matter. Don't want you to automatically think about all the teenagers and go, uh-huh. No, it happens both young and old. I mean, I have known of adults who've gone 20 years without ever taking their first drink, and then they get into a work-related party or social event at work, and they're in their 40s before they take their first drink. Why? Because of the peer pressure that's around them. They feel that they're in a situation where it's acceptable and where they need to do what everybody else is doing to be accepted. But we know what 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, right? I mean, I know you remember that be not deceived. Evil companions corrupt good morals or good character. So it doesn't matter how young or old you may be. If you find yourself in the wrong circle, then suddenly the tendencies then, because we want to be accepted, we will throw our moral values out the window. We will. We will cross that proverbial line because we want to be accepted. Now, what typically happens is there's two voices that go on in our heads. There's one voice, a good voice, that says, don't do this. You know it's not right. Nancy Reagan told you what would happen if you did. Don't do this. And you hear that voice. And then there's another voice saying, oh, go ahead and do it. Nobody here cares. Everybody else is doing it. Just don't get caught. That's a very rebellious voice. And when we listen to that very rebellious voice, rebellion is tied to anger. And so what we're ultimately doing is we are giving in to an angry voice because of our need of acceptance. Now, is the need to be accepted, is that a normal thing? Absolutely. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that need to be accepted and affirmed by the people around us. But the means by which of doing it, especially in this case of substance abuse, is a very unhealthy means of doing that. You also see when they're self-inflicted oftentimes that a person's spiritual life is being ignored. Anger management ultimately is linked to spiritual stability. When we maintain our relationship with God, our problems do not seem as overwhelming. That's just the beautiful reality of it. When we maintain our relationship with God, our problems, it doesn't mean our problems go away, so don't misunderstand me, but our problems do become more manageable. They become less overwhelming to us. When we maintain a sense of our worth, our self-worth, and that it's based in our relationship with God, suddenly we're not quite as irritable when people around us, they don't accept us, they reject us, or maybe just they're flat out being rude to us, We're mature enough to be able to just let that roll off our back. My grandmother used to say, you just need to be like a duck. It's just water on a duck's back. You just let that roll off of you. Well, as we mature, we should be able to do that. We should be able to just let things roll off of us. Being at peace with God, that actually empowers us to not feel the need to always be at war with all the imperfections of man around us. If I'm at peace with God, then I don't feel like I've always got to fight. I don't feel like I've always got to take a stand. I don't feel like I've always got to be heard. I don't feel like I've always got to make my point. If I really feel at peace with God, then I know He's got this, and I know He has me, and I know He's in control and not me, and I know above all, He's going to do a whole lot better job fighting my battles than I ever can. So I'm going to leave it in His hands because I'm at peace with Him. But when our spiritual life is absent, or it's not as strong as what it should be, that same stability that is so precious to us is gone. That's when we begin to link people and circumstances to our anger. It's all their fault. And I mean, let's face it, we all know how crazy everybody else is. And we all know how everything that happens to us in life just is not fair. I mean, we live in a world where everybody around us is nuts, and we live in a world where everybody around us is crazy. And if they all thought and acted just like me, what a great place this would be. But they don't, because they're all wrong, and I'm right. And everything I face is so unfair. Well, that shouldn't have happened to me. That wasn't fair. Isn't that funny? David likes to say that. It's not fair. So as a 6-year-old, I try to instruct him in the same way that somebody instructed all of us when we were 6. But like so many life lessons, we tend to forget that one, don't we? I mean, we may not be as vocally whiny about it, although some are. But we may not be, but in our heart, it's still there. And we still allow that to control us rather than us controlling it. You see, developing our spiritual life is going to be so much more than just being in Bible classes or in worship assemblies. Those things are so important. I can't stress how important those things are if we're going to grow. But it's got to go further than that. I can't think that my spiritual life is just going to grow by osmosis simply because I'm here. Being here is the beginning, not the end. All right, so being here is a wonderful thing, but there's more. I also then have to grow to a point that I can finally begin to recognize and acknowledge how dependent upon God I am, that it's not about me. I can't do this. I make my own choices, but I can't depend upon myself because I fail me over and over again. I've got to be dependent upon God. And as I become more and more dependent upon God, then I'm going to live my life more in accordance with His will instead of mine. And so I'll be carrying out His will, not my own. And then as I begin associating with people such as all of you beautiful, beautiful souls, then all of a sudden I find myself not as stressed out, not as overcome by the anger of this world, because I can find my acceptance amongst you. I know you love me. You know I love you. And there's such great comfort that comes in those godly relationships. You know, over the past several weeks, we've looked at how anger is a pattern, and we've looked at how it can develop and how it's not going to change overnight. And I know that's the last bell, but there are also a lot of other emotions that lap over into our anger. And if those other emotions are left untended, then that also leaves us vulnerable to anger. And so that's what we're going to kind of resume this next week, is looking at a few other emotions and how those expose our anger and kind of hit those buttons. Hey, thank y'all for your time and attention. We'll go ahead and dismiss there. Hi, buddy. You doing okay?